This is the tale of Mormon saints and sinners, from our roots until present day. Saddle up.
Gird your loins, lock your hearts, and pay your tithing, because we're bringing you the story of Mormonism in all its paradisiacal glory.
It's the Sunstone History Podcast.
Well, I've sinned so bravely, brother Brigham, brother Young. I've sinned so bravely, brother Young.
Hello, friends. We're back at the video gig here because we have breaking news.
Breaking news?
It's nerd news, but it's like nerd news that gets to the level of like actual breaking news.
Some say the biggest news in Mormon history in nearly 50 years.
This is pretty fun because this is something that we've known about and the location of it has been rumored, but it was confirmed. What are we talking about? So just a week ago, the Church History Library released a new manuscript collection that has the original 1886 revelation to John Taylor that is at the center of most fundamentalist claims to authority. It comes at a very interesting period of time, and as a result, it's been a controversial topic forever.
Forever, but some of us are not shocked by its existence because some of us have been talking about it for a long time. And
some people, I think, have talked about it for a whole year.
And some of us don't feel martyred at all by all the crap that they got.
Some of us
have
talked about this. Yelled out for it, and it shows.
Yeah, okay, so let's give some background to what we're talking about. So for those who are just tuning in, especially if you're a non-Mormon who has accidentally stumbled upon this video.
What are these people so excited about?
We're weirdos. That's all you need to know. So there is this thing called polygamy that exists in Mormonism that started way back in the 1830s and carried all the way into the 1890s. If you're to believe the traditional LDS narrative, the LDS Church stopped polygamy in 1890. It was shut down and no one ever did that again. But there are still polygamists today. Why? Why are there still polygamists in Utah? Why are there still polygamists all over the country? I always say wherever you find mainstream Mormons, you'll find fundamentalist Mormons. And a lot of them still practice plural marriage, this doctrine that they believe Joseph Smith instituted. We're not going to make polygamy denier jokes right now. So this idea that polygamy has existed, why would fundamentalists continue to practice it if in 1890 the church officially bans the practice?
Yeah. So we'll talk about all of this today, but first we thought let's back up just a little bit and talk about what was actually released, and then we'll talk about why it's important. So it's a fairly small collection, but the very first document immediately recognizable to us is a high-res scan of the original revelation. It's on two pieces of paper in John Taylor's handwriting.
So we've been talking about this before. I talked about this on Year of Polygamy, and this is part of the fundamentalist lore. So if you want to know why there are fundamentalists that still practice it, they actually have paperwork. They have receipts where some mainstream LDS people don't with this history. And what they've claimed is that John Taylor in the 1880s had this revelation, which we're going to talk about what it says, and basically says polygamy is never to leave the earth. And we have had scans of this. We have had
photos have been out there since 1938.
But low res, right?
Not great quality.
Not easy to read. And
Yep.
so, we have translations and transcriptions of what the revelation said, but no one really had seen the original. We've seen the copy of the original.
And no one was totally sure where it was.
Yeah, we should talk about the rumors of what we've heard over the years, because some of them, seem very plausible and some seem very fantastical. So the existence of this revelation that John Taylor had, now John Taylor was the prophet at the time in the 1880s. He was an avid polygamist. He also had been in Carthage jail when Joseph Smith was murdered. And so...
Well, yeah, because he had to kill him.
Stop it. No, we're not doing polygamy denier jokes.
Not today.
We already know they're fired up over this, which my condolences. More paperwork that, validates the history we've been talking about for a while. But the fact that John Taylor, a prophet, is writing a revelation saying it's never to leave the earth, and then just a few years later, the church LDS current prophet after John Taylor says by the way, we're done with polygamy. We're going to write this manifesto. And of course, if you know the history of polygamy, it's a lot more murky than that. But that's what has just been uploaded. Tell us about where, why, how.
Yeah, so we'll put the link on the video here, but so it's just like any other collection at Church History Library. It's open, it's digitized. So that's the first document, is the Revelation, and we'll read it here in just a minute. And then the rest of the documents kind of get at more at the I cover up is about the only word. Like it was denied for years, either that it existed, or if it did exist, that it was not authentic. It was not genuine. So also in this collection, we have a 1909 typewritten copy of it that was done, importantly, by Joseph Fielding Smith, longtime apostle, son of church president Joseph F. Smith, grandson of Hiram Smith, brother of Joseph. So right at the center of Mormon history. So yeah, for decades, an apostle and also church historian. So that's a faithful typewritten copy from him from 1909. And that's fun because we knew that one also existed, but no one has seen that.
Well, and just a note about that. So it was known amongst contemporary historians at the time when Joseph Fielding Smith was church historian, everyone worried he was not a good steward of history. They accused him of being very in line with Kate Carter, who ran the Daughters of Utah Pioneers Museum, and they had a vast archive of pioneer and church documents that they worked with the church to archive. And of course, I'm going to talk about this in my forthcoming Juanita Brooks book, so you can see where I'm getting this information. But basically, Joseph Fielding Smith and Kate Carter were known for getting rid of things they didn't like, for things that didn't reflect well in the church. And I can say that by the 1940s, the reason why Joseph Fielding Smith probably had less qualms about translating or transcribing this is because polygamy wasn't as stigmatized then as it would later become. And so it's interesting to see Joseph Fielding Smith not destroy a document that makes the church.
Well, that's the thing. He usually wasn't a destroyer. He was a hider. Like he would sock stuff away, and then it was not available to researchers.
Yes. I mean, but there are rumors that it's worse. We have no proof of that.
A good friend of ours, we had just had this discussion again, that he wasn't, neither one of us see him as a destroyer of records, more a socker away.
Yeah. Well, and I'm biased because I think Dale Morgan hated his guts. Dale Morgan was like...
That generation of historians had a really hard time. So this is Dale Morgan, this is Fawn Brody, this is a generation of researchers.
Juanita Brooks tried to get documents from him about the massacre affidavits, and it was like you said, it was this game of cat and mouse. But to know that this revelation has made it this long and hasn't been destroyed, I mean, I think you're probably right. They don't destroy the documents, and it's not to hide the history. I think they revere the people that wrote it. They revere the documents. And that brings some interesting theological questions that we're seeing various communities in Mormondom struggle with, which is this a sacred document? Is this a revelation for a prophet?
Yeah.
Or is it not realistic? Fundamentalists have long held that this is like a foundational doctrine.
This is the origin story.
Yeah. This is their origin story. This is their receipts. So they're feeling very validated. A lot of the folks in the Mormon fundamentalist communities are really excited right now about this.
Our friend Christina Rossetti, now Christina Galliano, just went on Mormon Renegade and talked to Dave about that. And obviously, yeah, this is huge news among fundamentalist Mormons.
Can we talk about how the leak happened, or should we not?
Well, it wasn't necessarily a leak so much as it was a long process. So, and this is actually, we'll talk a little more about the next video that we do, is the Church History Library has made great strides over the last decade for sure, but the last couple of years, it has really sped up. The quick version is apparently internally in 2018, they made a decision to be more transparent at the heart. And the core of it were general authority and officer collections is what they call them. And they've gone to a policy now that 70 years after the death of the person, the collection now becomes eligible to be released. And so as a result of that, over the last year, we have seen the Anthon Lund journals, we've seen the Heber J. Grant journals, just barely within like the last couple days. I'm probably the only person outside of the Church History Library that knows this, the John Widtsoe journals. So, and the thing that's important is that none of these came with fanfare, just like this one. So the way that they have these zillions of records that they are working hard to release and digitize, which is amazing. And what they do is every month they have a blog post where they round up everything from the last month that's been made available. And so I think a lot of people look at this like there's something weird or nefarious going on, when in reality, the release of this particular collection is just like all of the others they've done over the last couple of years. So I would disabuse anyone of anything of like some conspiracy going on. It's just, this is the latest collection that was released and digitized.
Which can put some fears aside. I know LDS people are like, does this mean we're bringing polygamy
Is this
back?
paving the way for something?
As far as we know, this is a historical decision. It's about archival documents being brought to light. Like he said, it's not because anyone's being prepped. I mean, I don't know how to tell you this if you believe that. Like, this doctrine, these ideas already have been existing in ether, even within the mainstream church. So they wouldn't need to have to prep much for something like this. But again, the reason why it gives this provenance for the story of did the LDS Church abandon polygamy? Officially, and what does that mean when a past prophet says it's never to leave the earth versus today? So that's interesting. But I do want to talk about, I called it a leak, but how we found out. Breaking news was by Christina. Yep. Christina found out.
A whole bunch of us in the inside of the nerd community woke up Saturday morning to messages that this collection was available. And it was so much fun because, again, like in our circles, it was maybe less breaking. For everyone else, like this was huge, like because this is a part of Mormon history that not many people know about, honestly. It's a time period and a subject that have not been talked about a lot. I
think for me, I felt validated. It was just like, we've been talking about this for a while. Yeah. I mean, I was thinking about the scan and how I've used it in our Sunstone presentations. We've probably had it in like 3 of our things. I've taught courses at the U before, and I remember talking about this, because I'll be brought in as a guest lecturer to talk about why we have, fundamentalists in this community, why they believe what they do. And I'll use this document, this scan, and sometimes the Latter-day Saints in the group will be offended, or they'll demand that. I actually spoke for a BYU youth group and talked about this a few years ago, and the Q&A after was like, where did you say that document was? What does it say? How do you know that? That's not real, and I get it because it's very challenging, but it's wild to think that I would just lie about that. Like I would be like, and
make up
I really want the church to look bad, so I'm going to make up a revelation by the prophet. That's insane. It's just something we've known about. And we were talking about Bryan Hales because I was like, man, I'm validated, but also like I took some shiz for this from people. And it's fine. It wasn't that big of a deal, but it was just like, wait a minute. We could have had this document all this time. But you brought up the fact that Bryan Hales has been talking about this for a long time.
Yeah. There has been a pretty good consensus among serious historians of this topic and time period that the revelation was authentic, wasn't John Taylor's handwriting. But again, we didn't have the original of the document. And that's always nice to have, even if you're 99.99% sure you've got the history right, you want the document. And so it was so nice to have it. But what was interesting, and this is the first thing I noticed about it, is on page 2, you can see something bleeding through. And you flip it over, and it's a date. It's the date that John Taylor died. Well, one of the other documents in this collection explains that. But I found that fun because that tells us that the photo of the document was created way back when, before it comes into church hands. So that it was just like one little more nugget that helped tell the story better.
And that's what I will say for the critics out there that think it's a big conspiracy to hide stuff. And like I said, I don't think that there have been good stewards acting in the good faith of history necessarily in the church history's office throughout the course of it. Kate Carter was definitely destroying documents, but the church historians now, we know them. They're the people that I've known and worked with are people of integrity.
Wonderful, fantastic people.
They know that I'm not always fair with the church. I did the horrible American Primeval consulting, and some of them will still work with me. They're people of integrity. And we're lucky that it's archived with such care. I mean, I think that that's the benefit to this right now. The scan has been great. It's been kept alive. We can talk about the fundamentalist libraries that we know of that where it was rumored to have been. But the fact that the church is archiving it, the historians in the office right now are good historians. And the Joseph Smith Papers Project is a good example of that. That is very thoroughly it's a beautiful historical archive. In fact, you don't have archives to that caliber. And so to have
digitizing, we cannot overemphasize the fact that they not just made it open for research, but digitized it, and literally anyone on the face of the planet can now go look at it.
Say what you will about Mormons, but they know how to keep their records like that. That is something that they're good at. And so I think that this is good news for history. It's not new news necessarily. It's new to a lot of people that are just finding out about it. But yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah. And I do want to point out too, to me, this is very good evidence that there is a move towards transparency. It's not always uniform, and it's not maybe as fast as historians would like it, but there is a concerted move towards transparency, because they didn't have to do any of this. The easiest course would to just keep it close to research. That would be easiest, because this history is difficult. It does require a lot of context to make sense of it. And guess what? So to make sense of why this revelation exists, why it's important, a quick review of what happens before 1886. So the quick and dirty version: Joseph Smith introduces polygamy, mainly it's in Nauvoo where he introduces it to others. And so by the end of his life, you have a couple dozen people involved. That speeds up after his death. The main body of Mormons come to Utah under Brigham Young. The practice greatly expands. And then finally in 1852, the world's worst secret is announced to the world. Orson Pratt gets up in a conference
by the world's best PR marketer who just knew that he was going to make the world fall in love with polygamy.
And it's so funny because Brigham Young chose Orson Pratt to do it, because they, of course, famously had butted heads on multiple things. So yeah, 1852, it's now an open doctrine of the LDS Church. And from that point forward, it just continues to grow until most adult Mormons, at least within the Mormon corridor, are polygamists. It is very much a core tenet of the church. Most people are involved in it.
And let's just note about that, because I think that it's relevant to this discussion. At this time, too, it's hard to prove that it was an official policy, but it was definitely talked about in official capacities over the pulpit in meetings that to be a man of stature in the church, to be a bishop and above, you had to be a polygamist. You had to believe in the kingdom. You had to believe in the law. There were requirements for leadership. And so you see a good portion of the Utah period up until the 1870s and 1880s even, where the majority of church leadership are.
And but during this period, what also happens as this becomes an official accepted part of Mormonism is opposition to it grows, and the opposition turns legal. So the first piece of legislation that's passed is in 1862 under Lincoln, who, of course, has slightly larger things to worry about than Mormons out in Utah. So nothing happens of it. It's a dead issue until a few years later when Mormons push the issue. Because they know that this law is on the books, then they think, well, we're not even enforcing it. It's unconstitutional. Let's just get it off, which causes lawmakers to think, right, maybe we should do something about it. So they keep talking about it. And then in 1874, the Poland Act is passed. That's the first serious piece of federal anti-polygamy legislation. That is when Mormons will start to go to jail. And pressure to do even more just keeps going. And so then in 1882, the Edmunds Act is passed, and that is significantly more. And the discussion changes from polygamy, which is really difficult to prove, to unlawful cohabitation, much easier to prove. And so from that point forward, that's really when Mormons start going to jail, including church leaders during this period.
And it wasn't just jail. What these acts did was threatened to disenfranchise Mormons from U.S. citizenship, which means they would lose their rights as an American citizen, their right of protection, their legal rights, their right to vote, all of these things, right? And so there are stories in Idaho where entire stakes would be excommunicated so they could go vote and then be rebaptized in the church to avoid these laws, because to be a polygamist was a crime. And so it wasn't just jail, it was disenfranchisement. They were going to seize their property. So the fact that they had been building these temples and sacrificing these temples, and remember that the Salt Lake Temple takes decades to build. And so we're talking about taking away property that are like sacred sites. So it's more than just like you're a bad boy or you're living in bigamy. It's we're going to punish the whole group for it. And I looked it up. David O. McKay was the first apostle, and that's 1906.
Because Smoot's an apostle. He's before that.
1902.
1900.
Anyway, continue.
Yeah, so and then that's a good point. Is it becomes a multi-pronged coordinated effort to bring the LDS Church to its knees if it will not renounce polygamy. And so the pressure on church leaders increases as well. So Brigham Young dies in 1877. There's a kind of confusing period where this is the same thing with Joseph Smith, where the Quorum of the 12 is in charge for a couple of years, until in 1880, John Taylor is now officially made church president. And from that point forward, he's the guy in the chair as the heat turns up. And so his personality is very much a stubborn one. He is not at all even considering giving in to the government. And as part of this, we get a series of revelations. And this is probably news to a lot of Mormons too, is that John Taylor was a revelator. This one is not unique by any means. There's, 10 or 12 during his time. And what's interesting is they are very much in the early Joseph Smith style of thus saith the Lord. They look very much like the revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants. Interestingly enough, some of them will be canonized, which definitely will be news to people. Part of that is because they were never canonized in English. They are published in English as pamphlets, but they are not canonized. It's only in foreign languages, which is such a weird concept that we don't quite know all the answers to.
I will say about John Taylor revelating, so something that I think is interesting, when I think of John Taylor, when I see the photos of him, I always thought he was this like proper British, gentry or whatever, but really he was a British cowboy outlaw. Like that's what you should look at him like. He liked to live the sort of outlaw life. When he went on the underground, he loves it. They have fun with it. They have code names, they have outfits, they have secret passageways. The homes famously in Salt Lake City, sometimes you'll find the polygamist hideouts, like a secret closet, a secret door, a secret staircase. And John Taylor purposely built those and built this network to be this like outlaw cowboy. But when he would go revelate, he would go into the wilderness. And so I don't know that Brigham Young really did this, but John Taylor was into it. He was Old Testament style. When he's on the run, he's like, I'm in exile, I'm out in the desert, I'm going to go on the top of the tallest hill and pray to the Lord for a few days. And I think Wilford Woodruff, his successor, does the same thing. They kind of get into this idea that prophets go into the wilderness to revelate. So John Taylor would do that. He would also do it in his bedroom at night, like old Joseph Smith style, and claim that angels visited his bed. He would also do it a lot on the run when he was hiding out for polygamy. So John Taylor was outlaw number one, and to this day, he is still considered a hero amongst the fundamentalists, most fundamentalists.
His rhetoric is unquestioned. It's very bold. So you can see how he draws people to him with that charisma. But then in 1885, he disappears. For the rest of his life, he will be in hiding. And his counselor, George Buchanan, a secretary, will kind of bounce from safe home to safe home throughout Salt Lake area and even in Davis County. And so it's at one of these homes, they're at the John Woolley home in Centerville in Davis County in September 1886 when this revelation is written down. But one of the big questions around it is who knew about it at the time? Because there is exactly no contemporary evidence other than the Revelation text itself for it at the time. There's not a single journal that mentions it. There's not a letter known that mentions it. Nothing. And then, as Christina loves to point out, Taylor goes and complicates the matter by dying the very next year. He's already in poor health at the time of the revelation.
So this brings up an issue that is longstanding, the Woolley family and Lauren Woolley's credibility, which we're going to talk about. But I tend to believe not Woolley's fantastical vision stories, as I don't believe in those with any Latter-day Saint that wrote them down to the degree that other people do. But I do think that what mainstream Mormons are really good at are finding their journals and archiving them. We still have a huge gap in the descendants of fundamentalists who have left. We don't have their journals. We don't have their writings. We don't have, because John Taylor doesn't talk about this revelation, and we'll talk about why, but there's said to be several witnesses and men that were there. And as far as I know, those men, all of their stuff hasn't been archived. So you're saying there's not evidence, but I'm still hoping that there is. So that doesn't mean everything that Lauren C. Woolley tells is true, but why don't you tell him the story, the lore, and then you can tell him why you don't believe it.
What's so interesting is, going forward from here, there are two narratives of this revelation and what it means. So there's one where it goes through one path that we'll talk about. The other, much, much later, the son of the owner of this home, John Woolley, Lauren Woolley, starts to tell a different part of the story. So the way he tells it is that while Taylor is staying at the home, not only is there this revelation, but there's this additional half. So the way he tells it is on a Sunday, Taylor gathers everyone that's there at the home, and they have a Sunday meeting that lasts for 8 hours. During this, Taylor tells them that the night before, he had been visited by Jesus and Joseph Smith, and during this meeting, he tells them what they had imparted to him, which was that polygamy would not ever leave, would always be a core tenet of Mormonism. Part of this is it alleged that there was a manifesto presented to Taylor to sign that would have done away with polygamy. And in Woolley's telling, he's so filled with spiritual power, he comes up off the floor and in bold language again, would sign this document? Never. I would have my arm severed from its socket before doing so. Then at the conclusion of this meeting, he writes out the text of this revelation. So in this narrative, that's where that comes from. But then importantly, he then also ordains 5 men who are there with the authority to perpetuate plural marriages. And importantly, they can also pass that authority along. But the problem is this narrative doesn't start to come out until the early 1920s at the very earliest that we know of. So this is the one method. The other method, much better documented, is that John Taylor's son, Apostle John W. Taylor, finds this revelation in his father's papers after his death, and then slowly, apparently starts to tell people about it. So a friend of ours, friend of the podcast, is reading his ancestor's journal, who is also a Woolley, who's like a cousin to these guys. And he tells that one night, he goes over to John W. Taylor's house for dinner, and Taylor pulls out this revelation and shows him and lets him read it. And it was of enough impact on him that when he got home, he writes a pretty good summary of this revelation, including a couple of the phrases exactly. So that's our earliest known reference to it outside of the revelation itself.
From the mainstream perspective. However, John W. Taylor is later becomes the head of a fundamentalist breakoff sect as well, because...
Whoa.
You don't think that's fair?
No. We'll talk about it.
Okay, I'll say this. I'll be more precise. John W. Taylor, like his father, was said to have never wanting to give up the practice. And so because of that, he steps down from the quorum he's excommunicated. And during the excommunication trial is when he supposedly waves the revelation around.
Now, this is an interesting one too. So our friend Christina has been on a couple things this week. And one of the questions that came out one of the interviews is, in 1911, when he is excommunicated at his trial, he has a copy of the revelation. I don't actually think it was the original. The reason is part of these things that have been released is that typed copy that Joseph F. Smith makes in 1909. He says he made that while the revelation was in the possession of a totally different guy. And that was only 2 years before. So my guess is that Taylor brought in a copy of it. And I say that because what's happening is slowly during this period, copies are made and are being quietly distributed.
When did Fielding record the Revelation? Because my understanding always was that it was before the excommunication trial.
Yep. Yeah, 2 years before 1909. What's going on is that John W. Taylor marries his last plural wife that year. It's thought to have been performed by his friend and also deposed apostle.
In what year was that?
1909.
1909. So pay attention. 1890 is when the Manifesto is. 1909, you have general authorities, apostles, who are breaking their own manifesto from years earlier. And that's why this is kind of scandalous. And when I say he starts the first break-off sect, he really does, because it's his own family and his followers, which will then seed fundamentalist movement with...
But they're all in the mainstream church, though.
Well, when has that started? It's like the Snufferites. To me, it's like LDS Extra. This is how we can argue about the break-off sect of John W. Taylor later, because I have strong feelings about this. But the fact that he is marrying plural wives, so he was a polygamist for a while, but the fact that he's marrying it so far after the Manifesto, this is in the early 1910s and 20s, all of a sudden the LDS Church, now they put out 2 manifestos at this point saying no more polygamy, we're done with polygamy. And they're still having problems within their own quorum. And so for those who don't know that history, know that that's an important part of this tension. This is why he's getting excommunicated for something that he did just a few years earlier, and it was fine to marry plural wives. But now, because they've had 2 manifestos, they can't really deny it anymore. There's the Reed Smoot hearings. There's a lot going on with Utah statehood. And so they don't want to mess up the good relationship that they are trying to have with the U.S. government, and folks like John W. Taylor are a liability. But he has this revelation from his father, which we now know exists and is validated, and we can see it. And so you can see why he was so passionate about his views.
And it's such an interesting discussion as to what was the actual effect of that 1886 revelation. Because you can, while it's not overtly talked about in these early years as being the reason why polygamy should continue, I really do think it's why they thought about it. So you see this network of John W. Taylor finds it, he gives a copy to his friend, Apostle Matthias Cowley, he gives it to a couple other guys, and then slowly it starts to make its way out.
Well, and I will say this too, the 1886 revelation wasn't the only document that came out of this time. John Taylor is having several revelations at 8-hour meeting. He's writing down, I think, several revelations that are of this vein that fundamentalists still claim that are part of this. So it's very possible that this wasn't that important of a revelation because the first manifesto wasn't out yet. It didn't, after he gives it, it's just in line with what John Taylor is already talking about, which is polygamy is important. I mean, John Taylor said this publicly, that it was an important principle. It was a saving principle, all of these kind of things. And so for him to pen it wasn't that strange. It becomes strange after the next prophet officially abandons it. And so that's where those, dueling prophets or revelations come into conflict. And so it's very possible that it wasn't like, and behold, another revelation, let's treat this with power. It was just another... John Taylor had lots of revelations. He had lots of things that he wrote down. So that's kind of why I think that it wasn't some sacred thing.
And part of it, too, is what happens with this revelation is very much different than what happens to other Taylor revelations. So there's another really important one from October 1882 that says, one of the key points is that it calls Heber J. Grant and George Teasdale to the 12, to be apostles, and Seymour Young as the 70, if they will conform to my law. And then it makes very plain in the revelation that it's not okay for guys living a lower law to preside over everyone. Like, you need to be living the higher law, and everyone knows it's polygamy. Is the word polygamy in there? No. Is it in the 1886 revelation? No. It's polygamy. You're hearing people try to make this something else. It's polygamy. The new and everlasting covenant to these guys in that generation meant polygamy. There was no confusion among them.
Yeah, it's not.
This is a later thing that gets into it that makes it more confusing when it doesn't need to be. But in this 1882 revelation, It's in every single journal of an apostle or first presidency member who is keeping a journal that we can look at. Everyone. They read it in the quorum meetings. They publish as a pamphlet. So this one kind of has this like mystical hidden quality to it.
Yeah, but I would still argue that, so 1882, he was under different circumstances. It's in the last 2 years of his life. The things he were writing, he was writing a lot of things that were important, I would say foundational revelations like this, that I think, sorry, fundamentalists, get this later lore and grandiosity and stories of heavenly visitors and stuff attached to it more. But I don't think John Taylor was writing, my theory is that John Taylor is writing a lot during these years, that it wasn't necessarily like the 1882 where they all copy it. Because first of all, at this point now in 1886, they're kind of scattered. He's in hiding.
But they're coming to meet with him, though. That's the part that I find so fascinating, is he doesn't seem to tell a single one of them about it. It's so weird to me, and I don't know why.
That we know of. I mean...
But again, like, we have those very same journals. So you go from one revelation where every one of them writes it to this one where none of them talk about it. So the difference between the two, I think, is one of the most fascinating and currently inexplicable parts of it.
You do have fundamentalists that say that the grandfather or whatever was there, and I think Woolley's story, and I can't remember now because it's been a while since I've been in this history, but there were like 10 men at one point in an 8-hour meeting. How many people were witnessing? There was a group of men.
Yeah, there's like 20-ish people that are there, and then 5 that are actually ordained.
So I think it's that, but the other thing that I was going to say that has changed is that this idea, because we saw a YouTuber was trying to say, polygamy is not real, or this revelation isn't real because it wasn't voted for the general body. Revelations didn't work that way at this point. Like Bryan said, usually if it was something really important, it would be recorded by several people. It might be talked about in council meetings or something like that. But this idea that like he's going to have this revelation and hold it up like they did with the Manifesto, that's not what they did.
And because what's so interesting too, and creates problems later on, is because this revelation is a thus saith the Lord, whereas there is no thus saith the Lord ending polygamy, just flat out. That's an issue. That's
been a huge debate amongst people talking about the Manifesto, if it's a manifesto, if it's a revelation, or if it's just a policy. And you would be surprised how nerdy the minutia gets over these words, but like policy versus revelation, for Latter-day Saints, that matters. And I think people are trying to do that with this revelation right now, but it
makes the history cleaner to do that.
For sure.
Undoubtedly.
I mean, again, there is inconsistency throughout the history of how the quorum does stuff, and there's development, and of course everything evolves. So things that are happening now have not always been that way. That is true. But I would say that it's pretty understood both culturally and theologically that saying thus saith the Lord is an official revelation. Joseph Smith talked about that, so did Brigham Young. And so this John Taylor revelation does, like Bryan says, say that. The Manifesto does not. And so people will be like, which one is real? We don't know.
And the problem, of course, with arguing that Wilford Woodruff's 1890 Manifesto was intended to do, and that's the thing, is like the language is squishy. It's not very definite because it wasn't meant to be. But in practice, you have Wilford Woodruff, who marries a plural wife 7 years after. You have, I think it's 7 of the Quorum of the 12 at that time marry plural wives after the Manifesto, including a host of bishops, stake presidents, most of the mission presidents. If the Manifesto was in fact binding, as later people will argue that it was supposed to be, then how do you square this? And that's the easiest answer, is that it was just a press release. It was not intended to stop polygamy, and indeed did not stop polygamy, not even close.
And so we've talked about 2 manifestos, the 1890 Manifesto saying polygamy is done, 1904, we're serious, it's done, and then the 1933 Manifesto, which is interesting because J. Reuben Clark calls this the pretended revelation in that manifesto.
This is a public statement that is released. It's published in the church news. It goes out to every bishop and stake president with a letter saying this must be read in a sacrament meeting over the next couple weeks.
And this is where it gets murky for me historically, because you have the official narratives of what happened with John Taylor, what happened when he was in the underground period. You have underground histories talking about this. Really good. We have some really good histories about that underground period. But then you have fundamentalist lore and fundamentalist oral histories and even fundamentalist documents. And that's where it gets really murky because, and this is where we kind of have a disagreement with Lauren Woolley. Like, I take seriously a fundamentalist claim about their ancestor in the same way that I take a mainstream person's history of their ancestor. Now, Bryan is right to be suspect of anyone having a history of their ancestors, but I would argue that that's what Mormon history is, and you have to decide what's validated by the documents. Unfortunately, with this history, there's very little documented with evidence because it's people remembering things, people claiming they were in the room when the revelation was there, claiming that it was passed. But I really do think that as history progresses in Mormon history and we have more fundamentalist sources opening up, we might get some of those pieces filled in, because for me, the lore that I've heard all kinds of stories about what happened. A lot of them are people, fundamentalists, claiming an ancestor was in the room, was outside the room, was there when they talked about it in a meeting. I heard a story once where Rulon Jeffs was waving it up around 50 people, and of course I've heard several Rulon Jeff stories of similar nature. That he had it. I know that there's a strain of Mormon fundamentalists that believe that the Nielsen family, the Nielsen-Naylor family had it. That's where I kind of suspected a copy of it was. And so I've heard all kinds of lore about what happened to this revelation, where it went, who was there, how it happened. And what's exciting about this find for me is this kind of validates that we know that not everything that people were telling me was wrong. Like, there's some truth to it, some anchoring truth that the revelation at least exists.
So it is an interesting discussion because we should point out there are a couple contemporary journals from September 1886, two people who were actually there. So George Buchanan and then Samuel Bateman. And both of them describe a very characteristic, normal Sunday meeting, absolutely nothing out of the ordinary. And that's obviously, historically, that's a problem. If you have the only two journals that we know of that were kept by people in that room, both of them have nothing interesting to say. It's just a normal Sunday sacrament meeting at home. The response to that is usually some version of it was too sacred to talk about, or they were put under covenant not to talk about it. And my problem with that is one of our favorite lines from this podcast: Mormons suck at secrets. You can tell Mormons not to talk about something. You can put them under covenant to not talk about something. Doesn't matter. They're going to talk about it.
I mean, by the 1930s, the fact that J. Reuben Clark includes it in the Third Manifesto shows that it's not that big of a secret. I mean, people are talking about it. Do you want to talk about Nellie Taylor in 1933?
So this is really interesting. So that was one of the other documents that was released with the original of the Revelation, is a memo from new First Presidency Counselor J. Reuben Clark, talking about how it came into church possession. And this is another one of those cases where the memo wasn't actually new. There's a copy of it in Clark's papers at BYU for a long time, but functionally no one had seen it. And what it describes is that the First Presidency issues this statement in June 1933, and then when Nellie Taylor, one of the widows of Apostle John W. Taylor, hears about this, she says, that's interesting that we're talking about it being pretended. She says, I know exactly what happened, because she says in 1916, when John W. Taylor died, the same thing happened. She's going through his papers. She finds this. At some point, she gives it to John W.'s half-brother. So same father, John Taylor, different polygamous mother, Frank Y. Taylor, who is the president of the Granite Stake in Salt Lake, and a really interesting figure because he is a post-First Manifesto guy, but also a post-Second Manifesto guy, and somehow didn't get in trouble. He was one of Heber J. Grant's really good friends. I think Grant didn't know about the second marriage, or he would have yelled at him. So anyways, Frank Taylor apparently gets this revelation from Nellie and then sits on it. Grant goes to talk to him, and his response is really weird because he says, I have exactly no memory of this ever happening. I don't remember Nellie talking to me. I don't remember her giving it to me. But if she did, I know exactly where I would have put it. Which is not how you answer a question like that. Like, if you give me something and I totally forget about it, I'm not going to be like, oh yeah, no, I don't remember that. But if you did give it to me, I would have put it like right there. Like, that's not a normal answer. So there's probably more to the story. But it's at that point, July 1933, that the original 1886 revelation comes into church hands. So this has led to a lot of semantics. So when the 1933 official statement says the archives hold we do not have this revelation in our archives, it's like, okay, you didn't have the original, but it also says like no record of it. It's like, well, you had a typed copy, and Joseph Fielding Smith knew that it was legitimate. So in talking to friends of ours, good friends, smart friends, the most charitable reading of that is that when they say pretended revelation, they mean like the whole enchilada. The revelation text, the story that Lauren Woolley is telling, all of it together is not legitimate. Is a possibility. The problem is, then you should have been more specific. Jerry McClellan is a lawyer.
Are you saying that Lauren Woolley might be right? Is that what I'm hearing you say?
It's just like, if they would have been more careful and talked more like historians right then in 1933, it could have been a lot. Because they could have said, guess what? There was a revelation to John Taylor. He had a bunch of revelations. The Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, is not functionally much different than it. But as a church, we have decided it is God's will that this is no longer a live question. We're not doing polygamy now.
Well, maybe they don't believe it's a dead question. So my thing is 1933, this is an important year because, like I said, we've got the third manifesto, the pretended revelation, we've got what he just talked about with Nellie. There's a lot going on. And if you start looking right after, like in 34, 35, apostles start saying this, it's bogus, that didn't happen, it's not real. And I think that time period deserves better study from historians, because what is happening in 1933? Now, I can posit a guess, which is that this is when the Council of Friends, which is a group of some former, well, I guess they're all former mainstream excommunicated Mormons who are still practicing polygamy, including the Woolleys and the Taylors, go and form this Council of Priesthood Power, using this authority, using this revelation, and that happens between 1929 and 1933. And so that coalition happening, literally like co-opting and breaking off and having power, must have been a huge threat to these guys. And it's not just about them worried about the influence and this old doctrine and them not having control of Mormonism anymore. I think it was personal. They were all friends. They all knew each other. These guys that broke off, it was a schism of friends, and who start their own thing, friends and family members. Some of them are intermarried to each other. And so I really think that 1933 is a critical breaking point. But do you want to talk about what happens after 33?
Yeah, and part of it, too, is it's so messy because theoretically, Mormons still believed in polygamy. If I haven't bought a copy from Distribution Center like in the last week, but I'm pretty sure section 132 is still in there. It's almost like a ghost of polygamy is still hovering over everything. So if your doctrine is that you still believe in polygamy, you're just not practicing it live right now, that's kind of a weird limbo place to be in. And that's part of the confusion, is that they do still believe in it. You just don't do it. But so anyways, yeah. So
it's equally threatening when there are people that are just still doing it.
Right. Why aren't we doing it? If it's still a principle and we still believe in it, then we should still be doing it.
And by the way, we have a revelation from your guy too, John Taylor.
Starts, thus saith the Lord.
Yeah.
And
you can see why there was an interest in keeping this secret, quiet, putting it out of the way.
I think the biggest thing that's difficult to get around in that revelation is, how can I revoke an eternal principle in the voice of Jesus? It's a pretty decent argument. If something is everlasting, like, that's kind of the definition. It doesn't go away.
Well, again, say what you will about Joseph Fielding Smith not being a good steward of history. For him to even record a copy, is interesting because, I mean, maybe that's what he thought good history was. And so he was doing that. But you see a really public move with the quorum to deny its existence. So I do think that there was deliberate obfuscation happening.
And so just briefly, what's happening as the fundamentalist Mormon part of the group and the mainstream Mormons begin to diverge more and more. So we talked about, so beginning in the early 1920s, Loren Woolley starts telling this account of what happens of people being ordained to this authority, he and his father being the last two surviving members of that group. His father dies in 1928. The following year, 1929, Loren Woolley begins to, for the first time, ordain other men to this council with this same authority. And this is where we get people like Joseph Musser. Our friend Christina just wrote an award-winning biography of him. I'm working with her to publish his journals. You have this guy, John Y. Barlow. Later on, you'll have guys like Rulon Jeffs and Leroy Johnson, who will be added to this council. All of the key people in later fundamentalist history are starting to come together at this very crucial time period. And what's interesting is they're more and more starting to publish their ideas and the text of this revelation. And in the First Presidency Statement, they talk about how it had been distributed, the April conference right before that. And what's very interesting is that was apparently done by Charles Kingston. So what's going on is you have sort of a main body of fundamentalists under the leadership of John Woolley, then Loren Woolley, then a series of people. That's the main group that will later split to become the AUB and the FLDS. But then you also have sort of on the parallel tracks, you have the LeBaron family, so Ervil LeBaron going on. You also have the Davis County Cooperative Society, the Kingston Group. So you have all of these people who overlap in this idea that polygamy is in fact an eternal and everlasting principle, should not have been given up, and should be continued right here and now, not just in some more nebulous eternity.
Yeah, and as you're talking about that, I was just thinking of the 1930s, how it's this change into a more modern church. So again, the church experience that modern Latter-day Saints have is very different from a frontier church. And often it would be families in outposts or congregations in rural areas who would be hosting their own church. They wouldn't even go to a church house. They would have meetings there. And so you have these sort of satellite family groups. And so in some ways, Mormonism then really paired well for these break-off sects like he's talking about. You have all these guys who are this loosely affiliated network of polygamists through family and dynastic marriages and things like that. But you also have differences of opinion, which had always existed. But when you're in rural Mormonism, you really only need to come together on those ideas when you're at war with the U.S. government or you're doing some church-wide thing. But otherwise, you live and let live as long as we kind of believe the same things and protect each other. But in the 1930s, you also have this change in America where it's this industrialization. People are moving from rural areas into the cities. And so there's this confluence of ideas. And you start to have these guys who they're not getting along. They've been living their Mormonism. Their dad said one thing. Their patriarch believes this. This is their interpretation of scripture. And so you really see, I think Mormonism's biggest problem with all of its break-off sects are anyone that leaves the church, including fundamentalists, have the disenchantment with the organization in common. But from there, it's all different. And so you see that with Mormon fundamentalism, but many of them still cite this revelation as important evidence. And so even like the LeBarons, for example, they eventually develop a theology that's very different from like the FLDS, for example. But they still, a lot of these guys, and I will say this too, the modern militias, the white supremacists, the white Christian nationalists that come from Mormons, and there are a lot of them, they used John Taylor's rhetoric, his Revelations 2, when I went and met the Bundy family and I saw their book of, the press calls it scripture. I wouldn't say that. It's their collection of scriptures. A lot of it's John Taylor, and that surprised me. I thought I would see Skousen and Benson and, these like sort of anti-communist folks, but really it's John Taylor. And so John Taylor is pretty prolific outside of mainstream circles as well.
It's this bold, independent, anti-government, let us live our religion rhetoric, I think, is how you could boil down the essence.
Very John Taylor. Yeah.
So anyways, this, hopefully you can see why this has been so controversial, why it's interesting, why it's important. And it's fun because it's sparking a lot of people to have to pay attention to this history that otherwise may not have. Because guess what? It's really fun. There's a lot of fun things that happen after Joseph Smith.
Should we read the Revelation?
Yeah, so we wanted to share with the Revelation so that you can see, and then we have just a snippet from the 1933 statement to kind of see what was the position, the official position on it going forward.
Okay, do you want me to read it? September 27th, 1886. My son John, you have asked me concerning the new and everlasting covenant and how far it is binding upon my people. Thus saith the Lord, all commandments that I give must be obeyed by those calling themselves by my name, unless they are revoked by me or by my authority. And how can I revoke an everlasting covenant? For I, the Lord, am everlasting, and my everlasting covenants cannot be abrogated nor done away with, but they stand forever. Have I not given my word in great plainness on the subject? Yet have not great numbers of my people been negligent in the observance of my law and the keeping of my commandments? And yet have I borne with them this many years, and this because of their weakness, because of the perilous times, and furthermore, it is more pleasing to me that men should use their free agency in regard to these matters. Nevertheless, I, the Lord, do not change, and my word and my covenants and my law do not. And as I have heretofore said by my servant Joseph, all those who would enter into my glory must and shall obey my law. And have I not commanded men that if I were Abraham's seed and would enter into my glory, they must do the works of Abraham? I have not revoked this law, nor will I, for it is everlasting, and those who will enter into my glory must obey the conditions thereof. Ever so, amen.
You can see why this is such a important text. It's so bold, and I love the part where it's like when I'm yelling at AI for screwing up instructions. Was I not clear enough? Like, what is the thing? I have commanded it. If you want to be the Church of Jesus Christ that you call yourselves, then you need to do my law, and it's not going anywhere.
What do you think of the apologist argument that is developing, we're seeing in real time, which is that like it was never voted in the general body of the church?
That's such an interesting part of the discussion, because to me, that's the only line of argument that you can really take here. You can't argue it's not John Taylor, it's John Taylor. You can't argue it's not polygamy, it's polygamy. Now, was it brought up? It wasn't. But this is so fun. This is in the panel discussion. Ben Schaefer pointed out that the Righteous Branch has canonized the 1886 Revelation, and in the preface is a statement from Bruce R. McConkie, famously a mainstream LDS apostle, who said essentially, a revelation does not need to be canonized to have the same binding effect. If it's God saying it, canonization is something men have developed, right? If God says it, it's binding.
I mean, I kind of agree with that historically, because at times there are official processes and other times there aren't. It's kind of loosey-goosey. And it's this argument of like, and you'll hear this with blood atonement and all these kind of things that Brigham Young was preaching over the pulpit. I believe if a prophet is teaching it over a pulpit, it's considered doctrine, advice, theology for the body that they're speaking to. You might disagree with that. LDS people fight over this kind of stuff all the time. Like, well, it's not official if they don't. If a prophet carrying that weight is speaking as a prophet, certainly saying, "Thus saith the Lord," I don't know how you argue out of that. Now, if I were making the mainstream argument, I would say this. I would say, well, John Taylor said it was never to leave the earth, and the next guy said it was. Like, that's the modern prophets. They repeal what the other ones have said and done. I think the murkiness with that argument is you really have to contend with the hypocrisy of Wilford Woodruff, who puts out the manifesto and subsequent
can't follow
partners.
it himself.
Can't follow it himself. Marrying
And nothing happens to him. No one says boo.
Yeah, 1896. He 6 years after he issues the manifesto, he's marrying a plural wife. So, yeah, I mean, the reality is pretty simple. The sort of knots that we twist ourselves into as Mormons to try to make sense of this is just like, is it real? Is it not? I mean, this is just the history of what these people believed. I don't believe it. I don't have to accept that this revelation is true. So it doesn't bother me in the same way that it used to. I don't have to make a defense for it. I just think it's fascinating, especially because it shows the messiness of public and private discourse in Mormonism, what we tell the government versus what we don't, what we tell the general body of the Mormons versus what they do in private. I mean, it asks all those questions, but also finally, like, people are taking Mormon fundamentalist claims seriously, and that's the work that I've tried to do. I'm not telling you to accept a doctrine or a lifestyle or theological choices. I don't ask people to do that, but fundamentalists and their stories and their histories are as legitimate as the mainstream. And growing up mainstream, there is still people that, wonder why I've engaged with these folks, why I talk about their history, because I'll legitimize them. And it's like, they're people who have lived a Mormon story that is as legitimately Mormon as yours. And so I think that that's what this this discovery is really doing for people. And that's an uncomfortable thing to contend with when the mainstream has spent a lot of time, in fact, even a name change, to distance themselves from fundamentalists who still follow this revelation.
And I think that's part of the reason that so much of the messaging on it after that was calling it a pretended revelation.
Who was he pretending? Was John Taylor?
Well, that's part of it. I think
dress
he's
up?
trying to distance that it wasn't John Taylor. That was probably the best. It's not right, but that was the most powerful argument. Well, it wasn't actually.
Argument, it was a lie. I mean, the fact that Joseph Fielding records it, we know that they knew of this revelation. So we know by at least the excommunication trial, which is what, 1907.
Taylor,
yeah. 1911. So by 1911, they know about this revelation. And so to say it's pretended, I mean, they're just gaslighting people. To me, it's like, you can't say that J. Reuben Clark didn't know about its existence. J. Reuben Clark knew everything.
John Woolley is his uncle. That's part of it too. You mentioned that, but like the family entanglements are really interesting through this period. I mean, this is Clark, whose father was an ardent believer who wanted to be a polygamist. His uncle is John Woolley. Lauren Woolley is his cousin. We have figures like Hugh B. Brown, whose father is a patriarch, very much at the center of the growing fundamentalist movement. He's blessing them to have many wives. His daughter then marries Rulon Jeffs, who earlier in their marriage decides that he wants to be a polygamist. So you have all these people in very difficult, confusing, complex positions. And the history of it had been, polygamy from the beginning has been messy and vague and secret. And so that hadn't changed. So this is a very complicated period for everyone to try to work their way through.
And we're getting long on time here, so we'll wrap it up. I do want to tell my favorite fundamentalist lore story that involves Rulon Jeffs, and then let's talk about Sunstone, and where we'll be talking more about this. But yeah, when we talk about this fundamentalist lore, it's interesting because even it's hard for me to take my own advice sometimes in taking these oral histories seriously, because I've heard all kinds of interesting, sometimes fantastical stories about what did happen and what didn't happen to validate the fundamentalist claims. And I have to remind LDS people, when they hear fundamentalist stories and are like, that would never happen, like, settle down. Your guy dug up gold plates from an angel, a ghost spirit in New York. Like, we all
maybe have a little more empathy for stories that on the surface seem wild.
Yeah. Just because you're encountering them the first time does, But my favorite story is around this time. So J. Reuben Clark, and Bryan cannot wait till we get into this history, and this really is fascinating history. J. Reuben Clark goes on this like CIA spy mission to root out fundamentalists. And so I heard this story from several people who are descendants of the Barlow family, which is a big FLDS community. And so on his shirt.
He is my shirt.
So they claim that Rulon Jeffs, in a meeting in the 70s, held up a letter from J. Reuben Clark calling him. So Rulon Jeffs was mainstream, like he talked about, married Hugh B. Brown's daughter, and was hobnobbing with LDS apostles. And so the fundamentalist claim is that J. Reuben Clark gave this letter to Rulon Jeffs calling him to disrupt the priesthood. So he was sent to go marry into polygamy, to go underground and to like disrupt them and ruin fundamentalism. And so a lot of fundamentalist takes on that lore now is that Rulon Jeffs' son, Warren Jeffs, of course, destroys FLDS. And so that was the fulfillment of that. And I believe that maybe J. Reuben Clark maybe had conversations with Rulon Jeffs. That makes sense to me, but I don't understand how you could believe that Warren Jeffs was the extent of that, because Warren Jeffs was horrific in every single way. But it is an interesting story. And so I always say this, if anyone ever can find that letter for me, I've heard that there were 50 men that witnessed it in the meeting. I would love to see that letter from J. Reuben Clark. That would be the find of the century for me. So, but yeah, that's the kind of lore that we've been dealing with. And I don't know, stranger things have happened. You've got John Taylor's Revelation that just got validated quite publicly.
So hopefully you can see that this is interesting and that we love talking about it. We will be talking about this again at the main symposium this year. So the last weekend of July, we will be at the University of Utah, and we're going to do a presentation on this. And that'll be fun because we'll be able to show images. So we'll show you the original Revelation. We'll show you Joseph Fielding Smith's copy. We'll show you the official statement, diary entries, you name it. We'll have a lot of fun stuff.
And it's going to be during lunchtime too. We're doing 2 sessions. You can register at sunstone.org. And our first session is going to be on...
Our first one will be sort of the fruits of this. So we'll be talking about one of the most interesting people everyone's never heard of. His name is Judson Tolman. He is one of the most important people in the development of what becomes fundamentalist Mormonism. So he's a patriarch in Davis County who marries a whole bunch of people, including he performs a marriage for Joseph Musser. He performs a marriage for David Jeffs, father of Rulon Jeffs. Rulon Jeffs is the son of one of these marriages.
He's a post-Manifesto naughty boy.
Very interesting. He is very old and has an incredible story. One of his own marriages is performed by a man in a mask. So
don't give away all the goods.
Oh,
we're going to talk about it on Friday, and then on Saturday we're going to do a lunch session covering this, and Bryan's going to, give you his Book of Mormon tours at the Benchmark books too.
There have been a lot of good books on this topic, and we'll have those there, because if you think like this is a bunch of details, there's a lot more parts to this story, and they are fascinating. So,
plus it's Sunstone. It's going to be awesome. It's our 50th year we're celebrating. So register, sign up, come meet us there. Come see cool sessions. Thursday night, it's John Turner opening up with his new Joseph Smith biography. And John Turner is great history. So I'm excited about that.
It's going to be a fun symposium. We got a lot of good stuff on the register. You get to hear us twice. Think how fun that'll be.
The song you heard today is called Brother Brigham, Brother Young by artist Corb Lund. Check out his music at corblund.com and consider giving a donation to sunstone.org to support this podcast.